This is actually the third video on the metaphysical poets. We have already made a class recording on John Donne, and then we have produced the class recordings on poets like Abraham Cowley and Andrew Marvell. And in this video, we come to find the other important poets of the metaphysical school, like Richard Crashaw and George Herbert. And George Herbert seemingly the very important of metaphysical poets. Therefore, we actually have to discuss Herbert in detail. And when we go in to find Richard Crashaw, Crashaw was born in 1613. And he belonged to the school of Donne. He was also a metaphysical poet. And his father was a Puritan clergyman. And he later converted to Catholicism. And he was also a pamphleteer. The father was also a pamphleteer. And Crashaw studied and taught at Cambridge. And when Cromwell became the parliament member of Cambridge, and Cromwell was elected as the parliament member of Cambridge. And because Crashaw was a Catholic, he was ejected from his teaching post. And when Cromwell became the parliament member of Cambridge, so he sent Crashaw away from the post of teaching. And he was forced to go into exile. And during the interregnum, he was forced to go into exile. And he went to Italy and became an attendant to Cardinal Giovanni Battista. So he became an attendant to an Italian lord named Giovanni Battista. And at this time, he turned to become an adamant Roman Catholic. And Crashaw was a Baroque poet. And we come to find the specialty of the Baroque poetry. And he is interested in artistic style for sculpture, painting, architecture, dance, theater, and music. And this is what we come to find included in the Baroque poetry. Poetry on sculpture, painting, architecture, dance, theater, and music, what called the Baroque style of poetry. And Crashaw turned to become a Baroque poet. And he was also a Hellenist and a Latinist. So he supported the Latin literature, learned Latin, and was a great supporter of Latin literature, started by Virgil, Ovid, and Horace. And he was also at the same time a Hellenist, supporting Greek literature, entertained the Greek literature. Hellenism is the study of Greece. And Latinism is actually the study of Latin literature, and was greatly influenced by Italian and Spanish classics also. So he lived for a time in Italy and learned Italian and Spanish classics also, and was greatly influenced by Latinism, Hellenism, Italian and Spanish classics. And he turned to become a Baroque poet. Wrote Latin poetry also. And there are 3 collections of poetry published during his lifetime. And one small volume was published posthumously, and it was entitled Carmen del Nostro. And the Latin title actually means Hymn to Our Lord, and it contained 33 poems. And his first collection of poetry was Epigrammatum Sacrorum Liber. And we have to remember this title, a book of sacred epigrams. And he was also an epigrammatist and produced a book of sacred holy epigrams. And it is entitled Epigrammatum Sacrorum Liber. And from him, we remember the title for the book of epigrams called Epigrammatum Sacrorum Liber, a book of sacred epigrams. And he is very popular for one of his poems entitled Steps to the Temple. And actually the title is a reference to Herbert's poem, The Temple. Herbert has got a collection. He admired Herbert George Herbert. He was actually a devotee of George Herbert, and Herbert seemed to be one of the major metaphysical poets. And Herbert produced a collection of poems called The Temple. And he had produced a poem called Steps to the Temple. And the title is actually a reference to Herbert's The Temple. And Lorraine M. Robert says that Crashaw tried to follow the steps of George Herbert. Actually, he followed the footsteps of George Herbert, and imitating the temple produced by Herbert, he produced the Steps to the Temple. And Crashaw is popular for his epigrams, and the collection of epigrams came to be called the Epigrammatum Sacrorum Liber. And he had 33 poems in a collection called Carmen del Nestro, or Hymn to Our Lord. And after Richard Crashaw, we come to find George Herbert, one of the leading poets of the metaphysical school. And he is popularly called the Holy Herbert. And his poetry profoundly religious. And he was the finest of the religious metaphysicals. And he was a contemporary of John Donne. He was born in 1593 and he was born in an aristocratic family. And initially he led a worldly academic and public life. But at a later stage he became a priest. And he wrote no love poetry. Also, no poetry was published during his lifetime. Herbert produced a number of poems, and most of his poems were profoundly religious. And he is regarded as the finest of the religious metaphysicals. And he was contemporary of John Donne. And even though he was born in an aristocratic family, he left the aristocratic living and turned to become a priest. In the beginning, he led a worldly academic and public life, but became a priest in his late years. And produced no love poetry, and at the same time, no poetry was published during his lifetime, even though he produced many poems. And when we examine the poetry of Herbert, we come to find the collection called The Temple. Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations, they are subtitled. The Temple, Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations. And the collection contained 160 religious poems. Remember, the number of poems included in this collection, there are 160 religious poems. And Herbert wrote actually in Latin and Greek, along with English. And in the temple, we come to find only English poems. And there are 160 religious poems included in the collection called Temple. And actually, there is a story behind the publication of the Temple. We have seen that during the lifetime of George Herbert, no poems were published. And actually, at the time of his death, he handed over the collection of poems entitled The Temple to one of his friends named Nicholas Ferrer. At the time of his death, he handed over the collection of poems to one of his friends named Nicholas Ferrer and asked him to publish it could save a soul, or to destroy or burn them if it could not help a soul. If it could help a soul, save a soul, publish them. And if you find that these poems will not be able to help the people and save their soul, so try to burn them. And it was the opinion made by Herbert at the time when he handed over the poems to his friends. So on his deathbed, he handed over his poems to his friend named Nicholas Ferrer and asked him, if the poems can save a soul, publish them. And if they are not supposed to help the people and save their souls, so try to burn them, don't publish. And the poems became published and it came to be very popular, and it contained 160 poems. The published poem, actually, the collection begins with the poem, The Church Porch. The first poem in the collection is entitled The Church Porch. And there is a poem entitled The Wind House. And there we come to find a metaphysical conceit. A true priest is compared to a glass. There a priest is compared to a glass through which God's light shines more effectively than his words. So the image of God shines through him, and a priest is almost like a glass through which the image of God shines. And so the priest, a true priest, is compared to a glass in the poem The Windows. And I told you there are 160 religious poems included in the collection called The Temple. And the temple has got a subtitle, Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations. And it is published in the year 1633. And it was in the year Herbert became dead. And at his deathbed, he handed over the collection to one of his friends named Nicholas Ferrer, and asked him to publish the poems if they can save a soul, or to burn them if they fail to save a soul. And the poems became published by Nicholas Ferrer. And the collection begins with the poem The Church Porch. And there is a very popular poem called The Wind House in the collection. And in this poem, we come to find a metaphysical conceit. A priest is compared to a piece of glass through which the light of God passes better than his words. And there is also another popular poem called The Caller. The Caller presents a spiritual conflict of high intensity. Actually, The Caller is a poem quite often prescribed in the university classes for the postgraduate students. And a popular poem, The Caller. And collar is the thing that we keep on our neck. This is the collar. And it presents a spiritual conflict of high intensity. And we find him struggling against the mild yoke. And actually, God has placed the collar on our neck. And we find him struggling against the mild yoke placed by God on his shoulders. And he talks about breaking the collar and returning to a state of reckless liberty. And everyone, including the poet, wants to break the collar being fixed by God. So God has fixed a collar on our neck, in fact, to control us. Like we have placed the collar on the neck of dogs. We control the dogs by keeping a neck collar. And God has actually placed the neck collar at the time of our birth. And actually, God has got his control through the collar. But while a person is alive, he tries to break the collar to free himself from God and to enjoy a state of reckless liberty. However, in the case of the poet, one word from God is enough to bridle him. As far as the poet is concerned, he tried to break the collar and enjoyed reckless liberty when he was young. I told you, Herbert was born in an aristocratic family and led a worldly life when he was a young man. And after all, he became a priest in his later years. And he enjoyed liberty when he was young. And in the poem, The Caller, he speaks about his fight against God when he was young. And he speaks about the control of God. And all human beings have neck collars. And God controls them. And the poet also had the neck collar, controlled by God. But at the same time, he tried to break the collar and tried to enjoy reckless liberty. But at times, one word from God could be enough to bridle him. Even a single word from God could bridle him. And he knows that it is the voice of paternal affection. When he hears the word from God, he becomes bridled. He becomes controlled. And he knows that the words of God are not commands, but they are voice of paternal, fatherly affection. and hence he submits to the will of God. Most obediently, he submits to the will of God. And there are short poems also included in the temple. For example, there is a poem called Mary, and it is an anagram of army, to put in the opposite manner. Army can be put in the opposite manner as anagram. And this is a way of writing anagrammatic literature, anagram. And in Samuel Butler, we come to find Vaughan. Vaughan is actually Nobel, and it is the way of producing anagrams. And Herbert has got a poem entitled Mary, but actually it is the anagram of the word army. And there are only 2 lines in the poem. How well her name an army doth present. How well her name is Mary, and it is actually army. How well her name an army doth present, and they are called Mary, in whom the Lord of hosts did pitch his tents. God has put his tents upon the army, and they are to be referred as Mary. And in this poem, we come to find that there are only 2 lines, and it is included in the collection Temple, Mary, and it is actually the anagram of army. And when we come to find the popular poem called The Caller, we come to find a spiritual conflict of high intensity in the mind of the poet. And we find him struggling against the mild yoke. Actually, it's a mild yoke, not at all a heavy yoke. We don't feel like carrying the collar as a heavy thing. And we are controlled by God, and it is actually the control of the God. And if we do wrong things, God will control us, punish us. And after all, Herbert is also found fighting against God to release himself from the collar and to engage in reckless liberty. And when he was young, he enjoyed life. And after all, a single word from God was enough for brightening him, for putting him in a proper position. He knows that the voice of God is the paternal voice, and it is the voice of paternal affection, fatherly affection. And therefore, he submits to the will of God most obediently. And it is interesting to note that the whole poem built around a single image, and that is the collar. And the collar to a dog is a symbol of both slavery and protection. Actually, the collar is a symbol of slavery. And when a collar is tied to a dog, it is a symbol of captivity and slavery. But at the same time, it is a symbol of protection. And according to Richard Baxter, a famous literary critic, earthwork and heavenwork make up his poems. So it was the opinion made by Richard Baxter. And there was Helen Gardner, and she produced the opinion that it was headwork also. So not only earthwork and heavenwork, but it was headwork also. And Richard Baxter maintained the idea that in the poems of George Herbert, there is hard work and earthwork and heavenwork. And Helen Gardner added headwork to this characterization. And he had produced, I told you, many number of pattern poems. The poems of Herbert vary in length and rhyme scheme also. And in Mary, we find an anagram of army, and there are only 2 lines. And it is to be called a pattern poem. And there is a poem entitled The Altar, and it offers another example of pattern poetry. And the lines are arranged as ordered in an altar. There are the long lines and the short lines looking like an altar. So the lines are arranged in a manner that the poem looks like an altar, and it is entitled also Altar. And Herbert was a master in producing pattern poems. And there is another popular poem called Easter Wings. And in the Easter Wings, we come to find the lines are arranged like the spreaded wings of a bird. And the poem is entitled Easter Wings. And remember these pattern poems. Mary is anagram of army, constituted of only 2 lines. And then the altar, so it is written in the format of an altar. There are long lines and short lines, and the poem altogether looks like the shape of an altar. And in his poem Easter Wings, we come to find the lines are arranged in a way that look almost like the spreaded wings of a bird. And Herbert known for his pattern poems also. And he had also produced a few prose works. And the one prose work produced by him was A Priest to the Temple. Actually, it was a prose work produced by Herbert. And we come to find that in Crashaw, there is a poem called Steps to the Temple. And A Priest to the Temple is actually a prose work produced by Herbert. And Herbert has got a collection also called The Temple. And the title, The Temple, can be found in 3 different areas. So one is Steps to the Temple, a poem produced by Crashaw, imitating Herbert's collection of poems called The Temple. And Herbert has got a collection of poems called The Temple, and it contains 160 religious poems. And at the same time, Herbert has got a prose work also, and it is entitled A Priest to the Temple. So don't get confused with the titles. Steps to the Temple, poem by Crashaw, and Priest to the Temple, prose work by George Herbert, and Temple is actually the title for his collection of poetry. And remember, the only prose work produced by Herbert is entitled A Priest to the Temple or The Country Parson. It's alternately titled Country Parson. It offers practical advice to rural clergy. Actually, the prose work offers practical advice to rural clergy, and the clergymen in the rural area are always so frustrated with their duty in the village. And they may say that they will be interested in doing work as a priest in the town. And in the prose work entitled A Priest to the Temple, Herbert gives the priest a practical advice, telling them that the things of ordinary use, for example, the plow, the spade, the axe, and the tools used by the villagers in the hamlets, so are actually things reminding us the glory of God. And these are things which remind us the glory of God. And therefore, the priests working in the rural areas must be satisfied with their job. And they should have to consider, so the tools used by the villagers for their ordinary use are actually things representing the glory of heaven. The things used by the villagers in the rural areas actually represented the glory of heaven. Therefore, the priests in the rural area must be happy to do their work in the rural churches. And this is a prose work written by Herbert addressed to the priests working in the rural areas. And the prose work was published in 1642 along with Herbert's remains. And it was published by Barnabas Woolley. And it was Barnabas Woolley who brought out the prose work A Priest to the Temple. And along with that, he also produced the various pieces of poetry under the title Herbert's Remains. And the collection was brought out by Barnabas Woolley. And actually, Herbert was a collector of proverbs. And he had a collection called Outlandish Proverbs, published in 1640. And the proverbs actually included more than 1,000 aphorisms. There were more than 1,000 aphorisms in the outlandish proverbs. And they were later published under the title Jacula Prudentum. And remember the title Jacula Prudentum. And it was published as part of Ole's Herbert's Remains. I told you the prose work entitled A Priesthood to the Temple was published in 1652 along with Herbert's Remains, the remaining works of Herbert. And it included the proverbs collected by Herbert, entitled Outlandish Proverbs. And when Barnabas Ole published the Herbert's Remains, he changed the title into Jacula Prudentum. And this is one important piece of information that we have to remember for the UGC questions. George Herbert produced a prose work called A Priesthood to the Temple and subtitled Country Parts. And actually the prose work offered practical advice to the rural clergy and reminded the rural clergy that the things used by the people in the hamlets are actually things representing the glory of God. And they have to be satisfied and happy working in the rural areas. So helping and saving the souls of the people in the rural areas. So they will have to help the rural people to keep up their Christianity and virtue. So the priests can remain virtuous when they work in the rural areas. And they should have to consider the things of manual work and the things of ordinary use used by the villagers actually represent the glory of God. So they can be happy remaining in the villages. And this is a piece of advice being given by Herbert to the village priests. And this was published only in 1652. 1652, say a few years after the death of George Herbert. Herbert died in 1633. And Herbert collected a few proverbs also, so amounting to more than 1,000 proverbs. And he was a voracious collector of proverbs. And most of the proverbs were divine proverbs. And they were published under the title Outlandish Proverbs in 1640. Say some 7 years after the death of George Herbert. And remember that no poetry or no work was published from George Herbert during his lifetime. So his collection of poetry called The Temple came to be published only after his death. And he handed over the poems to a friend named Nicholas Ferrer. Remember the name of Nicholas Ferrer? Asking him to publish them or to burn them. If they can save the souls of men, publish them. And if they are not helpful, burn them. And they were published after the death of George Herbert. And Herbert also collected about 1,000 proverbs and put them as a collection. And after the death of George Herbert, the proverbs were collected independently and published as Outlandish Proverbs in 1640. And Barnabas Ole, the one who produced the work A Priesthood to the Temple and Herbert's Remains, included the proverbs also. And he changed the title into Jacula Prudentum. And it became a part of the Herbert's Remains. And we remember the name of Barnabas Ole also. We remember the name of Nicholas Ferrer because it was Nicholas Ferrer who edited the poems entitled The Temple. And George Herbert actually handed over the collection to Nicholas Ferrer. And Temple contained 160 poems and published on the year of George Herbert's death. It was published in 1633. And he also produced a few pattern poems, and there are the famous pattern poems like Mary. Mary actually an anagram of army. There are only 2 lines. And there is another pattern poem called The Altar, and it is written in a format. So almost resembling the size of an altar. There are long lines and short lines at the same time. And then he had produced another poem entitled Easter Wings. And the poem almost looks like the spreaded wing of a bird. And when we come to find the poem, we feel that it's almost like the wings of a bird. And these are the pattern poems produced by Herbert. And Herbert also produced a prose work entitled A Priest to the Temple. And in that context, I told you, Crashaw has produced a poem called Steps to the Temple. And Temple was actually a collection of poems from George Herbert. And George Herbert has got a prose work also entitled A Priest to the Temple. And it was published in 1652 by Barnabas Oley. And Oley collected the other works of Herbert and produced them as Herbert's Remains. And he included the Proverbs also produced by George Herbert. George Herbert, during his time, collected more than 1,000 divine proverbs. And after the death of Herbert, the proverbs were published under the title Outlandish Proverbs. But when they were included in the Herbert's Remains, the proverbs were entitled Jacula Prudentum. And Herbert was a lover of music also. And music seemed to be a great weakness to Herbert. Music seemed to be a great weakness to Herbert. And Herbert died when he was only 40 years. And Herbert was a skilled lutenist. He played the lute very well. And Isaac Walton in his biography records that he rose to play the lute even during his final illness. And there are references made by Isaac Walton, the great biographer. And we have seen Isaac Walton, a great biographer and a writer of piscatorial literature connected with fishing. And he had collected, so he had produced the biography of John Donne, Henry Wotton, Richard Hooker, and George Herbert. And we come to find that there is biography on Herbert also. And Isaac Walton is very popular for his collection of biography, which included the lives of Dr. John Donne, the metaphysical poet. Then there was Henry Wotton and Richard Hooker. And there was also the biography of George Herbert. And these people were all interested in piscatorial hobby. So they considered fishing as a hobby. And it was the contemplative man's pastime or recreation. Fishing was actually the contemplative man's recreation. And Isaac Walton actually produced a popular book called The Complete Angler. And it took almost 25 years for him to add the pieces to the collection. And the book actually discusses the art of fishing. And in the lives also, he speaks about the speciality of people who are interested in fishing. So Donne was also interested in fishing. Herbert was also interested in piscatorial hobby. And in the lives, we come to find the life of George Herbert also. And Isaac Walton in the biography of George Herbert refers to the interest of George Herbert in playing the lute. Herbert was interested in music and music seemed to be his great weakness. And he was a skilled lutenist playing the lute. And Isaac Walton in the biography of George Herbert records that George Herbert rose to play the lute even during his final illness. And about John Donne, we heard that Donne woke up from his sick bed and went to deliver a final sermon, then returned home and became dead. And in the case of George Herbert, he rose up from his sick bed and played the lute for some time, and then returned to the bed and became dead. And he died of consumption at the early age of 39. So continued to live only 40 years. And he became dead when he was only 39, and he was never a healthy man in all his life. And his poems seem to be very rhythmic, and there are 90 of his poems being used for singing over the centuries. And there are many poems written by Herbert sung by the people in the late generation. His poems seemed to be highly rhythmic also. And Herbert was interested in music. Music seemed to be his great weakness. And we come to find John Henry Vaughan also. There is one more writer, and Vaughan seems to be one of the very important metaphysical poets. And so we remember the name of Wordsworth whenever we remember the name of Vaughan. Vaughan's poem, The Retreat, actually influenced Wordsworth to produce his poem, Immortality Ode. Wordsworth was greatly influenced by the poem written by Vaughan, entitled Retreats. And Henry Vaughan seems to be one of the very important metaphysical poets, and he was Welsh poet and a physician. And during the Civil War, he supported the Royalists. He supported Charles II and the Royalists. And he had always a fascination for the Welsh countryside. So he was obsessed with the beauty of the Welsh countryside. He was born in Wales. And in his poem, The Praise and Happiness of Country Life, so he brought out a poem called The Praise and Happiness of Country Life. And there he speaks about his happiness in living his country. So he is a man interested in spending his life in his country. And Vaughan, as a poet, often reminds us of Wordsworth. And we are reminded of Wordsworth. Wordsworth is considered as a poet of nature. And Vaughan was also a poet of nature. And he was happy with the Welsh countryside and wanted to remain in his country, enjoying the beauty of Wales. And in this respect, we remember Wordsworth. Wordsworth was almost like Vaughan. And interestingly, the poem written by Vaughan entitled The Retreat influenced Wordsworth for his poem Immortality Ode. And the poem The Retreat, a thrilling anticipation of Wordsworth's Immortality Ode. And in both poems, we have the glory of childhood emphasized. So in the poem Immortality Ode and in Retreat, we come to find the glory of childhood. And we come to find child is the father of man, used as an epigram for his poem Immortality Ode. Immortality Ode actually begins with an epigram. Child is the father of man. And child is the father of man is a line used by Wordsworth in his poem called Rainbow. In a short poem called Rainbow, he speaks about it. He speaks about child as the father of man. And in Immortality Ode, we come to find Wordsworth using an epigram taken from his own poem. And it is, child is the father of man. And the Immortality Ode is actually an interesting anticipation of Vaughan's poem, The Retreat. And actually on visiting the grave of Vaughan, so Wordsworth became inspired to write the Immortality Ode on visiting the grave of Vaughan. So he went to visit the grave of Vaughan. And from there he got the inspiration to write the poem Immortality Ode. And the Immortality Ode actually imitates the ideas presented in The Retreat. And both poems praise the glory of childhood. And both poems speak of man moving farther and farther away from heaven. When one is a child, he is near heaven and he is part of the heaven. A child is actually part of the heaven. But when he grows, he moves farther and farther away from heaven. And this is what we come to find in Vaughan's poem, The Retreat. And the same is the idea presented in Wordsworth's poem, Immortality Ode. In both poems, childhood is emphasized, the glory of childhood emphasized. And both poems speak of man moving farther away from heaven when he grows older. And the grown-up man's only source of joy is the remembrance of his childhood days. And as far as a grown-up man is concerned, his only joy is to remember his childhood days. And childhood actually a period of angel-like beauty and innocence. And Vaughan speaks of his desire to travel back. And this is the reason why the poem titled Retreat. Retreat is actually going back, to return. So Vaughan speaks of his desire to travel back and treat again the ancient track. Actually, he wanted to return to his childhood. It's just a wishful thinking. Actually, this is a wishful thinking. If we remember our childhood and if we wish to return to our childhood, it's actually a wishful thinking, a very nice thinking. And such thinking itself is so soothing, but it is not practical. We are not supposed to return to our childhood. So such thinking is a soothing thing, and it's a wishful thinking to return to our childhood. And the remembrance of our childhood is the one and only thing that will help us in our grown-up periods. And the religious poems of Vaughan inspired by, actually he was also inspired by Herbert. And we come to find Herbert sandwiched between Crashaw and Vaughan. Crashaw was influenced by Herbert to produce the poem Steps to the Temple. And Vaughan was also influenced by Herbert. And he produced a few divine poems also, religious poems also, imitating George Herbert. And we come to find a famous title from Henry Vaughan, Silex Skindlens. And this is the most famous work of Vaughan. And the word Silex Skindlens actually means the flashing flint, the flashing or the burning fire. And it refers to the stony hardness of his heart. Actually, the heart is stony, like a burning fire. And that his faith is there in God. And it is having stony hardness. Hardness is the hardness of stone. And this poem, Silex Skindlens, seems to be highly biblical. And when the second volume of the book was published in 1655, he added a preface also to the Silex Skindlens. Silex Skindlens was a poem produced by Vaughan in 1650. And the title actually means flashing flint, burning fire. And it refers to the stony hardness of his heart. His heart is having great faith in God, like so a hard stone. And his hardness in faith is almost like the hardness of a piece of stone. And poem seems to be highly biblical. And in writing this poem, actually, he followed the footsteps of George Herbert. And Richard Crashaw produced a poem following the footsteps of George Herbert, and it is entitled Steps to the Temple. And Silex Skindlens was a poem produced by Henry Vaughan following the footsteps of George Herbert. And Silex Skindlens actually means flashing flint. And it refers to the stony hardness of his heart. And the poem seems to be highly biblical. And when a second volume of the book was published in 1655, Vaughan added a preface also. And there he refers to his earlier love poems as foul. And in the preface added to Silex Skindlens, he maintained the view that his earlier love poems were all foul and a contribution to corrupt literature. And he made an acknowledgement there and asked the forgiveness of his readers, telling the readers that all the earlier poems written by him were, the earlier love poems were all foul, and the contribution seems to be producing corrupt literature. And he also speaks about his conversion to the original faith through Herbert. And he maintained in the preface the idea that it was Herbert who converted him into religious faith, into original religious faith. It was Herbert who brought him into original religious faith. And he speaks about the conversion made by Herbert. And he speaks about the influence that he received from George Herbert. And Silex's influence actually imitated George Herbert's divine view. And the poem is highly biblical. And the word actually means flashing flint. And the poem was produced in 1650. And whenever we remember Henry Vaughan, we remember the name of Wordsworth also. Wordsworth was greatly influenced by the poem entitled The Retreat by Henry Vaughan. And Wordsworth produced his poem Immortality Woods. And it was an imitation of Vaughan's idea presented in the poem Retreat. In both poems, the glory of childhood is emphasized. And these are the things we learn from the metaphysical poets. And thank you for time being.